look, we're in that war for 20 years.
موږ ته پته ده چې په جنگ کې ناکام شوي دي. دوی خو وایي چې موږ خپل هدف ته رسیدلي، دوی په جنگ کې ناکام شوي.
The United States did what we want to do in Afghanistan.
افغانستان خلک ته جنجال او مشکل پرېښود. دوی تللی نو چې دغه خلک په معرض کړي وای، په جنگ بند شوی وای.
I concluded that it's time to end America's longest war. It's time for American troops to come home before we mark the 20th anniversary of that heinous attack on September 11th.
September the 11th, 2001, a day that reshaped the modern world. Having never known war on its own soil, America was struck at its heart.
I remember watching the World Trade Center burn on a TV at the CIA, and I was standing there like this, just looking at it. And a colleague of mine was standing next to me, and he said, "My God, do they have any idea what they've done? We're going to kill everybody now. Everybody."
The live apocalyptic TV images provoked the US into declaring its war on terror.
I think almost no Americans regret invading Afghanistan because we had to destroy Al-Qaeda. We had to.
On October the 7th, 2001, the US and its NATO allies launched Operation Enduring Freedom. The objective was to kill the terrorist leader Osama bin Laden and the Afghan Taliban, who gave him safe haven.
In the beginning, wasn't exactly a major success for the United States but we went in there with such a light footprint under Donald Rumsfeld that the Al-Qaeda and the leaders of the Taliban escaped.
It wasn't until 2011, 10 years after the campaign began, that American forces finally tracked down and killed Osama bin Laden. By then, the world's most wanted terrorist had found refuge in neighboring Pakistan.
So the United States is overextended in a part of the world it has no understanding of and is causing great, great damage everywhere.
They came aftermath of the tragedy of September 11, 2001. And we began to look forward with tremendous hopes towards a better future. But then they began to bomb Afghan villages and homes and get our people hurt and killed and homes destroyed. That is where the trend towards the negative began.
Though the bombs were aimed at the Taliban, many schools, homes, and hospitals in the area also suffered extensive damage. The air raids caused hundreds of casualties, a great many women and children among them. Despite achieving the declared objectives, the Western coalition continued to pursue the Taliban, seeming to ignore the resulting heavy collateral damage suffered by civilians.
American flag. Squadron patch. Name tape. Air Force.
I joined the U.S. military at the age of 19 in 2005. When I joined, I believed in protecting people and standing up to bullies, and I kind of felt it was my duty to do so. I wanted to be a hero. I wanted to help people and do good and do something constructive and productive, and I was sold on the idea that joining the military to fight for my country was that thing.
Brandon Bryant is a former UAV pilot. He flew drones and opened fire on targets in Afghanistan and Iraq. But Brandon himself was based in Nevada.
My first shot happened in eastern Afghanistan, killed 3 individuals, watched a man bleed out from the leg that he lost. Those happened on a regular basis, and there's probably about 300 bombs dropped a year from drones in general. It's really just a mess. It's point, click, and kill, man. It's so easy that anyone can do it. It's treated like a game, you know, in a perverted way. I believe that it's almost thrilling for certain people because it deals with real human lives. There's a higher stake. And I think that some of these generals and military officers that took part in these kinds of activities had that sort of thrill for the action. I was the guy who would follow orders. I got really injured in the military and thought that this was going to be my deathbed confessional. One particular instance where I was part of a crew that killed a child. It's like a knife. Every time I talk about it, it's like I feel this dagger in my chest. And I don't know how to reconcile that. But my original intent was just to free this burden from my soul, die in peace, if you will. Children were written off as dogs. Innocent people were written off as collateral damage, just tally marks in a book. Equations for a higher promotion, you know, those types of things. And it really was horrible. Because I witnessed innocent people being killed and children being killed, it makes me angry. It makes me infuriated.
All right. So this is my very first aerial achievement medal given to me by the United States Air Force. I had 36 of these when I left the military, but this was my first one. This box is what's left over of my military memorabilia.
I don't know how the United States will ever get this Vietnam off of our consciousness. It'll be a very, very long time and almost impossible to do. I just want to say that it's a colossal failure. Probably one of the most embarrassing events in military history.
Это поразительно, конечно. Да, американцы, которые вроде борются за демократию во всем мире, вели себя совсем в Афганистане недемократично. Они повторили ошибку, ту же ошибку, которую они делали опять-таки во Вьетнаме. Там они играли частями тел, здесь они мочились в Афганистане, так сказать, на трупы террористов, как они утверждали, афганцев, очень часто это были мирные афганцы. Бросается в глаза вот эта вот схожесть между сопутствующим ущербом во Вьетнаме, когда они были, и в Афганистане.
افغان‌ها هم در جمع ملت‌های دیگر در جهان با این فکر بودن که امریکایی‌ها آمدن بس افغانستان گل و گلزار است. ولیکن عملاً که امریکایی‌ها به افغانستان آمد ماهیت و جوهر امریکایی‌ها و دموکراسی امریکایی‌ها را مردم افغانستان شناختند.
امریکایان راغله چې د مدرسې موجودونه خلکو ودو باندې بمباري وکړه.
There are claims that the entire US military campaign in Afghanistan was marked by torture, murder and rape.
اور اولاد په مقابل کې د یو مجاهد د بل مجاهد په مقابل کې وجنګول. بیا نظمي راوست.
Operation Enduring Freedom lasted 13 years and officially ended in December 2014, to be replaced by a new NATO mission dubbed Resolute Support. In practical terms, it meant America's military presence would be reduced while retaining the military bases in Afghanistan. This revised operation served Barack Obama well as a positive PR exercise.
At the beginning of 2015, we will have 9,800 U.S. service members in different parts of the country, together with our NATO allies and other partners. By the end of 2015, we will have reduced that presence by roughly half. 1 year later, by the end of 2016, our military will draw down to a normal embassy presence in Kabul, with a security assistance component, just as we've done in Iraq.
البته د افغانانو د بغداد چې هلته دوی جنګ وکړي دا ډېر فرق لري. افغانان هغه ویور قوم دي چې روسانو چې ماته ورکړه، لیکن دوی هغه دغه نه وکړي چې روسان چې ماته ورکړه ماته بیا راکوي. دا فکر نه و.
That way, Afghan troops had to bear the brunt of military operations.
Afghan army. What was the reality of the Afghan army? The United States has spent tens of billions of dollars to build up this army of 300,000 people. 90% of the recruits to the Afghan army are illiterate. These are kids from backward rural villages, have no belief in the army, no support in the central government, and are very backward in a lot of ways.
The result was that within 2 years of Operation Enduring Freedom coming to an end, Afghan troops had suffered 4 times more casualties than the entire NATO coalition had in 13 years of being in the country.
آنچه را که در پیمان امنیتی برای مردم افغانستان پیمان بسته بود که ما دشمنان بین المللی تروریسم بین المللی که در حقیقت طالبان یک گروه صفاک، یک گروه خونخوار، یک گروه که بدنام بیش نبود، اینها را گنج از افغانستان اونها را نگهداری کرد به خاطر از اینکه باز دوباره اونها را پس تقویه کرد و اونها را به نحوی و امکانات برایشان ارائه کرد. اگر آمریکا در کفش شریک نیست، اگر غرض و مرض در اونجا ندارد، چرا بزدلانه بسیار کردلانه از این سرزمین بار و پندک خود را بست؟
Pakistani trucks crossing Afghanistan on the way to Iran were being hijacked by bandits, criminals, gunmen. And so they decided to take Afghan students who were studying in madrasas in Pakistan to guard the trucks as they crossed to Iran. And then they came up with the idea that maybe it would be better to just put the students in villages along the truck routes. The word talib means student. The plural is Taliban.
The Islamic Taliban movement emerged in the 1990s as an entirely new military power.
These students stood for law and order, and they had weapons. And little by little, they took over the villages. And then when they took over the villages, they took over the regions. And then finally, they took over the whole country. That's how it started. This was an operation launched by the ISI, the Pakistani Intelligence Service.
In September 1996, the Taliban captured Kabul without a fight, established the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, and imposed Sharia law. They claimed to have created a peaceful and stable Islamic state, free of corruption and lawlessness. But sheltering Osama bin Laden and destroying ancient and sacred Buddhist monuments helped cast the Taliban in a negative light in the court of world public opinion. After foreign troops were deployed in Afghanistan, the Taliban were largely defeated, and the rest went deep underground. But for 20 years, they continued to wage a bloody war against the foreign military presence.
Американцы, канадцы, британцы, они не выходили, в целом не выходили на крупные операции, выходя на какие-то частные боевые действия, и при этом все равно теряли своих военнослужащих. Власть же фактическая в уездах, в центрах провинции, она всегда принадлежала, будем говорить, талибам.
Now, in the wake of the US military withdrawal, the Taliban have regained the upper hand, while seeming to distance themselves from their militant predecessors of the 1990s. The Taliban now claim to be a multi-ethnic movement that does not, as it did before, consist solely of Pashtuns. It actively recruits residents from the Pakistani border regions, which were always a perfect foothold and training ground for well-disciplined Islamic soldiers.
Талибы 1996 года были прежде всего террористами без всяких планов. Талибы образца 2021 года – это Талибан, это движение, которое можно считать уже не террористической полностью, а и политической организацией со своим руководством, со своим четким планом действий.
The Taliban being listed as terrorists by the United Nations is the consequence of their action, of course. There is no alternative. Because there's no alternative. Things went wrong. Things went wrong, and they began to re-emerge, and part of the population went with them. So yes, talk to them. There simply is no other alternative.
While some wanted to enter into dialogue, others have taken up arms. These are the outskirts of Mazar-e-Sharif, the largest city in northern Afghanistan. This is where the Taliban met the fiercest resistance from the local population. The militia, formed of local volunteers, required no additional motivation. These people were fighting for their land.
امکانات فضل خدا هم 2 سال هم شورات جنگ کنیم امکانات داریم به فضل خداوند مردم هست خود ما امکانات داریم توانمندیش هم داریم استادگی میکنیم مقابل دشمن
ما راپور داشتیم که طالبان در این ساحه یک تعداد 200-300 نفر جابجا شده بوده باز راپور که گرفتیم میخواست که اونا عملیات سر ما انجام بده ما از اون پیشتر آغاز کردیم اونا را شکست دادیم و رفتن
اگر اینمی شکست چارکن تو شهر مزار میگه که شاید شکست شفاعت شمال شود بخیر ما در این مطمئن هستیم اینجی به فضل خداوند شکست نمیخوره ما بخیر مطمئن هستیم 100%.
On August the 14th, 2021, 1 week after this video was filmed, Mazar-e-Sharif fell to the Taliban. Jalalabad, one of the last key cities still under government control apart from Kabul, was captured the following day.
100% چه خاطر اینا یک گروه کوچک بودن آمدن در قطر اینا را گفتن بیاین در افغانستان صلح بکنین ما بریتون اما چی میتیم بریتون توانمندی میتیم چه قدرتی دولت باید شما بگیرین اینا را گرفتن بالا کردن یک وقت طال فعلا ولسوالیا چقدر در سطح ولسوالیا تقریبا 140 تا در دست ایناست اینا را در سطح جهان نشان دادن یک گروه کوچک زدن بزرگ جلوه کردن. کی کردن؟ خود خارجی ها کردن دیگه.
24 hours later, the Taliban took over the country and became the true masters of Afghanistan. Kabul fell, and the Afghan government soon followed.
و روند بیرون رفت خارجی ها از افغانستان باعث به این شده که ناامنی شدت بگیره و روز به روز ناامنی در افغانستان زیاد شود. بله، ما تقریبا 2013 نزدیک شده بود که ما وظیفه را ترک کردم. این هدف اصلی ترک وظیفه ما امی تهدید طالبا بود. ما چندین بار از شماره‌های ناشناس که خودشان خود را به عنوان طالب معرفی کردن گفتن ما طالب هستیم، ما نمیخوایم تو با خارجی‌ها کار بکنی.
Najibullah Ansari spent several years working first with American troops and then with German forces. He has repeatedly requested asylum for himself and his family, but all his requests have been denied.
به اینا ارسال کردیم و گفتیم ما به یک مشکل دوچار هستیم. به بار آخر اینا بر ما جواب دادن که گویا جواب تهدیدات شما از آلمان بر ما میآید. زمانی که طویل مدت شده رفت، یعنی دیر شده رفت، بالاخره تماس گرفتیم، گفتن که تهدید شما تاریخش دیر شده، یعنی قابل قبول برای ما نیست، یعنی گویایی که تهدید شما تازه نیست.
There were literally thousands of Afghan interpreters alone. People who'd worked with the foreign troops for many years held mass rallies as soon as the US announced their full withdrawal from the country. Some did manage to leave for the United States or Europe under special programs, but most were left to their own devices.
به نام یاد خدا، سلیمان سخیزاده هستم، یکی از مترجمین اسبق کارمندای نیروی آلمان که در مزار شریف در کامپ مارمول.
When Sulaiman started working with foreigners, he was barely 18. Back in 2008, his job was seen as quite prestigious.
یعنی ما سلیمان هستم، یعنی قماندان کندک است که قماندان تاسک فورس یا قماندان قطعات عملیاتیشان بودن در بغلان. همراه از اینا دوش وظیفه انجام دادیم که ما که طولای پیاده بودم که زیادتر مناطق بغلان هم ما شب روز دوش با اینا پیاده گشتیم.
Everything changed after 2014 when the foreign troops began to withdraw. Sulaiman lost his job after staff cuts, and he's been unemployed ever since.
با بسیار جایای زیاد، چندین جایا ما مراجعه کردم و چی درخواستی چی کردم. وقتی که سابقه کاری می‌ریم مرا پرسان می‌کردن که در کجا سابقه کاری داره و چی مدت کار کردی و ما میگفتم که سابقه کاری ما که نیروهای خارجی و که نیروهای نظامی آلمان است، مدت 8 سال زیادتر ما کار کردم. به هیچ جای مرا در وظیفه نگرفتن. به دلیل چی بود که خودت زیر تهدید است نشوه به خاطر تو جان ما هم در خطر بیفته.
And his concerns proved to be quite justified.
اصلا نمی کار کردن، تماس داشتن با خارجی با حساب برزنو با حساب یک مشکل کلان است که دمون رقم نفرا مشکل داره و بخصوص شاید ترجمان تا گارد و تا پاکار فرق کنه. ترجمان به نظر از اونا یک وسیله بوده که به حساب هم ماموریتشان در افغانستان همی ترجمان بودن که به حساب
Они пока выжидают, пока им нужно международное признание, показать фасад такой внешний, что Талибан – некое такое движение, которое хочет просто управлять Афганистаном и готово со всеми общаться. Поэтому сказать о том, что ждет переводчиков, которые сотрудничали с американцами, британцами, немцами, французами, и что будет с женщинами, вот тут возникает вопрос, а что будет дальше?
The year before the September 11th attacks, when the Taliban were in power, Afghanistan produced literally zero heroin, no heroin. And after the 9/11 attacks, they got to a point by 2010 where they were producing 93% of the world's heroin. I know this because I was the chief investigator on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee staff at the time, and I went to Afghanistan in 2009 to study the problem.
This part of Kabul is called Pole Sokhta, which means burnt money. A favorite haunt for drug addicts. It's easy to buy hashish, opium or heroin here. Neither during the Soviet presence in Afghanistan nor after it under the Taliban could this possibly have been imaginable. In 2000, in an attempt to boost the Taliban's image, its leader, Mullah Muhammad Omar, banned opium poppy cultivation anywhere on Afghanistan's soil.
В 2001 году был установлен минимум производства опия и составил всего лишь 180 тонн. В то время как в текущем году урожай будет 6500 тонн опия. Разница налицо. Учитывая, что героин и опий не поступают в огромных количествах в Америку и не являются для американцев угрозой, они не готовы тратить эти деньги, налогоплательщиков, на борьбу с наркопосевом.
This video was filmed in 2015, and numbers have only grown since then. Afghanistan is now the undisputed world leader in opium production. Poppy field acreage has now expanded to rival the size of some European countries. Afghanistan confidently holds first place in heroin production, and that lead is growing every year.
By 2009, the corruption index in Afghanistan is still the lowest, or the next to lowest. How did the Afghan economy survive? Through opium, through the drug trade. There were attempts to change that. They never succeeded. And the people in charge were very, very corrupt.
Heroin kills and feeds at the same time. Today, 1 Afghani in 10 is directly linked to opium production. In a country ravaged by war, trading in the opium poppy and its derivatives has pretty much become the only source of income for Afghanistan's rural poor, while giving international drug rings another way to generate huge profits.
Well, I went to Lashkar Gah, which is the capital of Helmand province, and that's where most of the heroin poppy is grown. And I very naively went to meet with a poppy farmer. And I said to him, instead of poppy, why don't you grow things with 2 growing seasons? Onions, tomatoes, pomegranates. And he said, with frustration, you know, the Americans told me in 2001 that if I told them where the Arabs were, I could grow all the poppy I wanted. And now you come and tell me I can't grow poppy? So I came back and I told John Kerry, who was my boss at the time, this is a real problem. We have to do something about heroin poppy cultivation. And he said, why? I said, because it's 93% of the world's poppy, heroin poppy. And he said, right. And it all goes to Iran and Russia, and we don't care if they're heroin addicts. And so we never did anything.
Opiates produced in Afghanistan are shipped all over the world through well-established smuggling channels. Around the globe, Afghanistan's opium industry kills hundreds of thousands of people every year. The explosive growth in opium production is one of the main byproducts of the US presence in Afghanistan, and arguably America's only real legacy after leaving the country. No substantial infrastructure has been built in 20 years. Scorched earth is all that the Afghanis have left.
находясь в Афганистане все эти годы, американцы блокировали проведение газопровода из Туркмении через Афганистан, Индию в Китай. То есть углеводороды, газ, в частности, туркменский, должен был идти на Кандагар, с Кандагара должен был идти в Квету, Пакистан, и дальше двигаться уже к Китаю. Вот нахождение там войск американцев блокировало проведение этого трубопровода. Это парализовывало отчасти развитие промышленности в тех объемах, которые могли бы быть.
The only real way to judge the 20 years of American presence in Afghanistan is by looking at the abandoned military bases. No industrial or social facilities were ever built in those years. In fact, throughout this time, Afghanistan continued to benefit from the Soviet legacy.
روسان چې د افغانستان څخه وتل اصل دلته پاتې شو او واقعیت دی چې روسانو دلته داسې یو کار کړی و چې یو مفادات یې و پالند او امریکایان چې د میدانو سوزي ازای نړۍ ازای د منځوري موږ ته چې ولیدل چې په افغانستان کې موږ تر اوسه پورې د بل مستعمل وو امریکایانو دا خدمت مرتنه وکړي نو زه فکر کوم چې هغه د خپل مفادات لپاره کوي په تر اوسه پورې چې موږ ګورو په دې نسبت باندې چې روسانو ځایونه پاتې شوي دي او جوړ کړي دي پاخه ځایونه جوړ کړي دي نو امریکایانو دا کار نه کوي.
Indeed, Afghanistan still benefits from infrastructure that the Soviet Union built. With Moscow's support, 150 major facilities were constructed, thousands of kilometers of mountain road, the Salang Tunnel connecting the northern and central regions, as well as dams, oil depots, factories, hospitals and schools. Not to mention an irrigation system installed by Soviet specialists that helped defeat hunger.
СССР оказывал экономическую помощь, восстанавливал заводы, разрушенное народное хозяйство, разрушенную экономику. И сколько потом осталось этих объектов, которые до сих пор действуют. Американцы вроде бы тоже потратили гигантские суммы денег. Прежде всего, конечно, на восстановление, как они говорили и говорят, афганской армии национальной, которая, видите, так сказать, при первом же натиске талибов они просто сдались и разбежались.
Ну вот эта картина. Это называется картина Майпар. Это гидроэлектростанция ГЭС на ГРУ, которые были построены со стороны Советского Союза. Очень большая гидроэлектростанция, самая большая. Очень красивое место. Очень красивое место.
Ghulam studies a map of his homeland woven into an oriental carpet. He knows every province, city and village, or kishlak, like the back of his hand.
Это очень большая трагедия.
After the Najibullah government was overthrown in the spring of 1992, Ghulam Muhammad Jalal was one of many high-ranking Afghani officials who were forced to flee the country.
После перехода муджахидов к власти было покушение на меня. Естественно, я был ранен. У Кабыля не было ни электричества, не работали ни больницы, ничего. Ни посольства работали, ничего не работало. Поэтому я уехал. Если бы не переезд, то не только моя судьба, но и судьба моей семьи, не знаю, чего было. Только Богу известно. Для меня Россия второй дом, а для них все Россия первый дом, потому что они здесь выросли. Даже спорим иногда по этому поводу.
Мы уже давно как адаптировались и...
Моя дочь, когда нормально разговаривает, ну, афганский, да, когда что-то надо правильно сказать, сразу переключается на русском.
Даже думаю на русском языке. Если я хочу на афганском сказать, я сначала с русского, перевожу на афганский, потом говорю.
For several decades, their homeland has known no peace. And now, more people than ever are trying to flee the country.
Беженцев будет очень-очень много. там женщины, там в основном интеллигенция. Им будет трудно, очень трудно жить под таким строгим правилом. Поэтому они вынуждены будут уехать.
And when the Soviets invaded in 1979, we can get into some of that history because it's very important. The U.S. began working with the Mujahideen. And the reason why the Mujahideen hated the pro-Soviet government was because that the pro-Soviet government was allowing women to get educated, was supporting land reform, and supporting industrialization and modernization. The most reactionary, backward Islamic extremist elements of the Mujahideen were the ones the United States put in and overthrew the more progressive pro-Soviet government that was giving women rights. And so for the United States now to be bemoaning the fate of women, there's a little bit of hypocrisy there, given U.S. history of U.S. involvement.
My own daughters are going to school in Afghanistan. They go to school right now. They go out and shop, they go out and play, they go to school. Because we are attacked by those extremist elements, terrorists who don't want us educated, we must add to our resolve to send our children to school, our girls to school. Never give up on that. I would. I'm sure millions of Afghans won't give up on that.
This yoga center in Kabul was established in 2017. Dozens of Afghan women attended here every day.
4 سال میشه که استودیو یوگا را بر خانم‌ها باز کردیم.
Well educated, with strong leadership skills and business prowess. There are very few people like her in Afghanistan. Every day, she makes her way to the studio, where she's greeted by waiting yoga enthusiasts.
روز میره رو پیاده میرم. حراس که قطعا داریم. مثلا در این مملکت خصوصا در یک قسمه هست که تو در حالتش حراس داری. حتی داخل خانه حراس داری.
But behind these walls, there's a very different Afghanistan.
میتونم بگویم اولین ترنر یوگا هستم که زمانی که طالبا رفت دیگه هر رشته‌ای میتونست کار بکنه. فکر میکنیم که هست. ما حتی به خاطر یکی از چالش‌های پوششه که در زمان تمرین زنان به تن دارن رفتیم لباس طراحی کردیم، لباس مخصوص طراحی کردیم برانگیز.
And despite all the precautions, she started receiving phone threats.
وقتی من تهدید شدم برای 2 هفته و خبر تهدید من در سوشال میدیا میچرخید و رسانه ها تا اندازه هیچ حمایت از این صورت نگرفت از حکومت و این خودش نشان میده که طالب هست، طالب زیر پوسته، این جامعه و این نظام وجود داره.
But now with the Taliban back in power, we can't reveal her face. White flags with the black Shahada now fly over every state building, not just in Kabul, but in every major city and at every checkpoint. The Taliban brought their convictions and their symbols. New rules are now in place. Women's faces on advertising posters in Kabul have been painted over, beauty salons boarded up. Women are obliged to wear the burqa. As a result, both demand and price have increased 10 times since the Taliban arrived. And this is just the beginning.
They believe in the strictest interpretation of Sharia law. They would be amputating people's arms. They were hanging people. They were certainly almost imprisoning women when they were in control. It was a very, very backward society. Will it be that bad now? We don't know for sure. But certainly the plight of women in Afghanistan is not something that I'm very optimistic about.
In the 1990s, the Taliban imposed the harshest restrictions on women. Female Afghanistanis could be stoned to death for failing to wear a paranja in public. They were forbidden to leave their homes without a male relative. Women were denied both an education and careers, and even medical care. All these rules were enforced by the religious police. Now the Taliban claim that they have changed and will let women be educated, have a job, serve, and even hold government positions. But these claims lack credibility and are often contradicted by the facts.
Yes, we are at this moment in a very, very difficult spot. There is immense violence in Afghanistan. There is immense anger in our country. There is vacuum felt in Afghanistan, and there was that presence of the international community and Americans for 20 years, NATO.
Boys and girls must now attend separate classes. Women are banned from all sports without full face and body covering, while female soldiers fear for their lives. The Taliban say that despite Sharia law, Afghan women's rights will be protected.
I don't rely or put my faith in the Taliban. I know the horrific history and the fears that many people in Afghanistan have, but we have to hope. It's not clear yet that the Taliban will be worse than Egypt or Saudi Arabia or Israel or 50 countries that the United States openly arms and supports and funds and trains. So if we're going to get the U.S. government to talk about human rights, that's the first step. There's a whole world out there. The first step is to stop arming the worst human rights abusers on earth because it's so clear and easy.
More than 2 million Afghans have fled to other countries as refugees. People started leaving in large numbers a few years ago when the Americans were still there. They left because they'd abandoned all hope of seeing peace restored to their homeland. And after the Taliban, the number of people wanting to flee has increased dramatically. They include not only women, but journalists, public figures, interpreters, and anyone else who worked with foreigners and helped to build a brighter future for Afghanistan over the last 20 years. But well-educated people weren't the only ones trying to leave, fearing life under the Taliban. Ordinary folk from the provinces had to abandon their homes too. They tried to save their families from the atrocities of war. The sun sets over a refugee camp on the outskirts of Mazar-e-Sharif. Another day has passed. Just like every previous day, it's been a struggle for survival. Alima describes herself as a spokesperson for the refugee camp. It houses 30 families, mostly ethnic Uzbeks.
اولسوار المار آمدم حسن پاریاب هستم هم پاریاب تعلق هستم اولسوارش هستم المار هستم این همه طور که برادران شاور جنگ بوده ایستاد شده نتانستم جنگ میشد شاو می آمدن این همه طور جنگ میشد که طالب میزد گاو میزد این ششتا نتانستم و ویای ما ویران شد این پس این همه طور یک خواهر من تیاره زد شهید شد برادر عزیز یک خواهر من تانگ توپ زد شهید شد همه طور در و در خاک پسر شد این همه طور بدر شد آمد.
Rags blown in the wind, fabric bleached by the scorching sun. A haphazard array of impromptu huts that sprouted in the middle of the desert. People who abandoned their homes and blossoming gardens have now lived in these squalid conditions for a year.
امی اشتکای ما عدیست گرمی یک گل آبی یخ نمیافت که بخوره علاقه میکنه بیرا گفتیم مدد تیپیش یک گل آب هوا میتیم و اینو بیرا گفتیم مدد کالاش تر میکنیم به این رقم میکنیم که ما امی اشتکی ما را اجل نزنه و نموره ما همینه بیرا گفتیم بالیش آب بده تا دم دیگر یک دم یدین هیل ما میخریم دیگر کشید یک کمی یک شمال میخده این اشتکای ما یک کمی دم تقلیم میکنه میدان ها میگرده به این مشکلات ما زندگی میکنیم.
مشکلات های ما خوردنی نداریم
پوشیدنی نداریم، مکتب نداریم، بچه‌های ما مثلا درس هستن میدیدی که این همه اشتکار همه وقت همه رقم زندگی. یک ساله که اولا که ما نمیفهمیدیم که اینا چه رقم زندگی میکرد، خوب زندگی میکرد، مثلا نان شابش همه چیز تهیه میشد. آمده اینجا مثلا یک دفعه نانای خوشکارینت به آب میخوره، بعضی وقت هم پیدا نمیشه، بعضی شب مثلا گوشت که ما میفهمیم اینا یک ماه هم شاید گوشت نخوردگی داخل از اینا باشه.
خر 50 بچه هست، همنا درس بخونه. ما خودم اگه بی سواد شدم در بدر شدم، حالا که ماندی نموشتگاه من درس بخونه.
And even here, the refugees worry about their children. Even among those who regard themselves as illiterate, there's a strong awareness that a good education is critical for their country's future.
مردمای افغانستان که ناپاهم است. از دست وزنا پیش سرش خارجای اونداست، اونا را حمایت میکنه. فقط افغانستان را در برادرکشی انداخته. دیگه چیزی نیست که افغانستان باید نسل مسلمان اینا ضعیف کنه.
After 20 years in Afghanistan, America has clearly failed to eliminate any of the problems.
Those who wanted to make money from a war on Afghanistan made buckets and buckets of money. The big weapons dealers, the war contractors, the reconstruction business, the mercenary contracting firms that do all the cooking and cleaning and work that the troops don't do anymore, they made buckets and buckets of money. And the politicians whose campaigns are funded with what we call in the rest of the world bribery, but in the United States we call it contributions, they got money into their campaigns and got elected. So if that was a goal, it was a big success.
I think that President Biden's position that he has no regrets is disingenuous. It's meant for public consumption. Certainly the Americans didn't know what to do long term. We just threw money at the problem, and that never works. You know, there's an old saying at the CIA that you can't buy an Afghan warlord, but you can certainly rent one. And that is not a long-term strategy. So here we are 20 years and $3.2 trillion later. We have literally nothing to show for it.
Over 20 years, roughly 750,000 troops from several countries served in Afghanistan. More than 3,500 Western coalition soldiers were killed. Americans suffered the most casualties among all foreign contingents. At the same time, by some estimates, the Afghan National Army and police lost more than 65,000 troops. The total number of civilian deaths is impossible to estimate, but it numbers in the hundreds of thousands. This bloodbath has brought neither peace to Afghanistan nor succeeded in defeating terrorism.
Now we're going to have not only the Vietnam syndrome, but the Afghanistan syndrome and a little bit of the Iraq syndrome. But the visuals are so reminiscent of the visuals of people trying to escape from the helicopters from the roofs of the embassy that, you know, the United States hopefully is going to learn some lessons.
Это самое большое поражение в 21 веке не только у США, у Запада. Потому что мир смотрел в Афганистан. Многие другие страны смотрели, что Америка пришла, значит, стабилизация будет, построение будет. А тут разруха. А кто еще будет пригласить их? Еще у них такой лозунг, что НАТО может установить, мировой порядок.
Initially, the Biden administration planned to end the 20-year war by 9/11. The 20th anniversary of the worst terrorist attack in US history, to which they responded with the longest ever military campaign. But they failed to make a graceful exit. Their withdrawal was more like a hasty retreat.
And Biden certainly didn't expect this to crumble so quickly, so he was unprepared. The thing happened just almost overnight. So they were saying 3 months. It ended up taking 3 minutes before this collapsed.
The main goal of destroying terrorism in Afghanistan, was it achieved? Yes and no. Al-Qaeda essentially no longer exists. Good for us. But Daesh exists, ISIS, which came out of Al-Qaeda. There are certainly other terrorist groups that are worse than Al-Qaeda. Look at Syria. Here, the United States is arming and financing The Nusra Front. That's an al-Qaeda group. How do you explain that to the American people? That this is the same group, or at least an offshoot of the group, that murdered 3,000 Americans on one day, and now we're sending them weapons and money?